If you enjoyed this interesting video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you even more exciting and thought-provoking content. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Join our growing community today. Your feedback, comments, and ideas truly keep this channel alive.
al-Qadir al-Jaza'iri, the Lion of Algeria. Chapter 1: The Birth of a Leader, 1808 to 1830. In the early years of the 19th century, Algeria was a land of tribes, traditions, and spiritual devotion. Among the green hills near the city of Mascara, a boy was born in 1808 who would one day rise as one of the greatest leaders in the struggle against colonial power. His name was Abd al-Qadir ibn Mujahideen, but history remembers him simply as Abd al-Qadir al-Jaza'iri, the Emir of Algeria. From the beginning, Abd al-Qadir's life was marked by faith and discipline. His father, Mujahideen, was a respected religious scholar and head of the Qadiriya Sufi order. This gave the young Abd al-Qadir a strong foundation in Islamic knowledge, spirituality, and leadership. Unlike many children of his age, his education was not limited to prayer and recitation. He studied Arabic literature, poetry, Islamic law, mathematics, and philosophy. These studies shaped his mind into that of both a scholar and a statesman. But Abd al-Qadir was not raised in the comfort of scholars alone. His father believed that true leadership came from both the mind and the body. He trained his son in horsemanship, archery, and swordsmanship. From an early age, Abd al-Qadir could ride at full gallop, draw his blade, and command attention with his voice. This combination of spiritual depth and physical discipline would become the foundation of his strength as a leader. By his teenage years, Abd al-Qadir had traveled with his father on a pilgrimage to Mecca. This journey broadened his horizons and introduced him to scholars and leaders from across the Muslim world. He absorbed ideas of governance, justice, and the importance of unity among believers. He also witnessed the threats that European powers posed to Muslim lands. These lessons would come back to him with force in just a few years. In 1830, the world of young Abd al-Qadir changed forever. The French launched a massive invasion of Algeria. With their cannons, warships, and disciplined soldiers, they stormed the coast and quickly captured Algiers, the capital. For many Algerian tribes, this moment brought fear and confusion. Some considered surrender, others chose to retreat into the mountains. But among the people of Western Algeria, a new call for unity began to rise. Abd al-Qadir's father, respected for his wisdom, was approached by tribal leaders to lead the resistance. But he declined, believing the task required younger strength. Instead, the tribes turned to Abd al-Qadir, then only in his mid-20s. They saw in him not just the son of a scholar, but a man who carried both knowledge and courage. In 1832, after long discussions, he was chosen as Emir of Algeria, the commander who would lead the fight against the French. The young Emir accepted the responsibility with humility, but also with determination. He told his people that resistance was not just about defending land, but about preserving dignity, faith, and freedom. His voice carried across tribes that had long been divided by rivalries. Slowly, he began to weave them together into a united front. As Abd al-Qadir prepared for war, he set an example that inspired loyalty. He prayed with his men before battles, shared their hardships, and treated prisoners with dignity. His leadership was not just military but also moral. This earned him respect not only from his allies but even from some of his enemies. The stage was set. Abd al-Qadir was no longer just the son of a scholar, nor just a young man of learning and strength. He was now the Emir of a nation under threat, the commander of warriors who looked to him for guidance. The French forces were powerful, but Abd al-Qadir carried something even greater, the spirit of his people and the fire of faith. As 1832 turned into the years of struggle ahead, the world would soon learn his name. Abd al-Qadir al-Jaza'iri, the Lion of Algeria, had stepped onto the battlefield of history. Chapter 2. Forging the Resistance, 1832 to 1835. When Abd al-Qadir al-Jaza'iri was chosen as Emir in 1832, he inherited not just a title but a fractured nation. Algeria was filled with tribes that often fought one another. Some were loyal to old alliances, others hesitant to trust a young leader. The French, meanwhile, were confident that Algeria would be another jewel in their empire. To them, Abd al-Qadir seemed like nothing more than a minor tribal chief. They could not have been more wrong. The first challenge Abd al-Qadir faced was not on the battlefield but in uniting his people. He knew that without unity, resistance would collapse. He traveled across western Algeria, meeting tribal elders, speaking in mosques, and calling for solidarity in the face of invasion. His words were not fiery slogans but reasoned appeals. He told them, "If we fight as scattered tribes, we are weak. If we fight as one nation under God, we are strong." This message resonated. Slowly, tribes began pledging allegiance to him. They saw in Abd al-Qadir a leader who combined faith with action, humility with courage. His reputation grew, and with it, his army. By 1833, he had created a disciplined force of cavalrymen and infantry, armed not only with traditional swords and muskets but also with fierce determination. Abd al-Qadir's military genius soon became clear. Instead of facing the French in open battles, where their cannons and rifles gave them the advantage, he turned to guerrilla warfare. His soldiers knew the land, the hills, the valleys, and the deserts, better than any foreign army could. They struck quickly, ambushed French patrols, and then vanished into the rugged terrain. For every step the French advanced, Abd al-Qadir made them pay in blood and frustration. But he was not just a warrior. Abd al-Qadir also worked to build the foundations of a functioning state. He established a government with ministers, judges, and tax collectors. But he was not just a warrior. Abd al-Qadir also worked to build the foundations of a functioning state. He established a government with ministers, judges, and tax collectors. He minted coins and organized supply lines for his troops. By doing this, he showed the world that Algeria was not simply rebelling but asserting itself as an independent nation under his rule. The French soon realized that Abd al-Qadir was no ordinary opponent. In 1834, the French General Desmichels signed a treaty with him, recognizing his authority over much of western Algeria. It was an incredible achievement for a leader who had begun his struggle with nothing but faith and a handful of loyal tribes. For a brief moment, it seemed that Algeria might carve out a future of autonomy under Abd al-Qadir's leadership. Yet peace was fragile. While Abd al-Qadir honored the treaty, the French saw it as only a temporary pause. Many in Paris considered Algeria too valuable to leave in the hands of its native people. By 1835, the French broke their promises and resumed their advance. Once again, Abd al-Qadir prepared his people for war. His ability to inspire was unmatched. Before battles, he would ride before his men, his white horse gleaming under the sun, his voice carrying across the ranks. He reminded them that they were not just fighting for land but for their faith, their families, and their dignity. His soldiers called him Emir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the faithful, and followed him with loyalty that no foreign power could buy. In the fighting that followed, Abd al-Qadir's tactics stunned the French. At the Battle of Makta in 1835, his forces destroyed a French column, leaving hundreds dead. It was one of the worst defeats the French army had suffered in North Africa, and it sent shockwaves through Europe. Newspapers in Paris, London, and Istanbul began to speak of the young Emir who had humbled one of the strongest armies in the world. But Abd al-Qadir did not allow victory to make him arrogant. He continued to stress discipline among his men. He forbade looting, treated prisoners of war with dignity, and insisted that even in struggle, morality must be preserved. These qualities made him not just a military commander but a moral leader, admired even by those who fought against him. By the mid-1830s, Abd al-Qadir was no longer just a local figure. He had become the face of Algerian resistance, a symbol of defiance against colonial domination. His fight was far from over, but he had already achieved what many thought impossible, uniting his people, building a functioning state, and proving that a colonized nation could rise in strength against a global empire. The French, humiliated and determined for revenge, began to prepare for a larger and more ruthless campaign. And Abd al-Qadir, young but unshaken, prepared himself for the long war that lay ahead. Chapter 3: Fire and Steel, 1836 to 1837. By the mid-1830s, Abd al-Qadir al-Jaza'iri had proven himself as more than a tribal leader. He was a commander who had forced France to acknowledge him through treaty, then humiliated their army at the Battle of Makta. But victory also brought greater challenges. France was not a power that accepted defeat lightly. After their loss in 1835, they sent new generals, more soldiers, and heavier weapons to Algeria. Abd al-Qadir understood that he was facing an empire with nearly endless resources. To survive, he had to outthink them. His army relied on speed, mobility, and knowledge of the land. French troops marched in columns, dragging cannons through narrow valleys. Abd al-Qadir's men, mounted on swift Arabian horses, struck like lightning. They would appear suddenly, shower the enemy with musket fire, and then vanish into the mountains before French reinforcements could respond. But he knew raids alone were not enough. He needed strongholds where his people could gather, train, and produce weapons. In 1836, he began constructing fortified camps and workshops deep in the Algerian interior. Blacksmiths forged blades and repaired muskets. Artisans crafted powder, saddles, and armor. Farmers were organized to ensure food supplies reached the fighters. Abd al-Qadir was turning scattered resistance into a war machine. The French, desperate to crush him, launched a new offensive in late 1836. General Clausel led a massive force against the city of Constantine in eastern Algeria, hoping to break local resistance and intimidate Abd al-Qadir's followers. But the French underestimated the spirit of the defenders. Constantine's walls held firm, and French troops were forced to retreat with heavy losses. This failure strengthened Abd al-Qadir's reputation. He had not even led the defense, yet people credited him as the symbol of Algerian resilience. More tribes pledged loyalty to him, swelling his army and extending his influence. His government now controlled nearly two-thirds of Algeria's interior, while the French clung mainly to coastal cities. Still, Abd al-Qadir never underestimated his enemy. In 1837, the French sent another general, Charles-Marie Denis de Damermont, to capture Constantine once more. This time, the French brought overwhelming firepower. The siege was brutal, and despite fierce resistance, Constantine fell. The French celebrated the victory, but Abd al-Qadir remained unbroken. He knew that Algeria's strength was not in cities but in its people and their unity. Even after the fall of Constantine, his guerrilla campaign intensified. His men struck French supply lines, ambushed convoys, and forced the enemy to fight on terrain they did not understand. Abd al-Qadir himself often rode at the front, his white horse charging through dust and smoke, his sword raised high. Soldiers later recalled how his presence alone lifted morale, as if God had placed courage in their hearts when they saw their Emir leading the charge. His leadership also extended beyond the battlefield. He was determined to show the world that Algeria was more than resistance, it was a state. He established a capital at Tagdamt, where he built administrative buildings, schools, and mosques. He enforced justice through Islamic law, making sure disputes were settled fairly. Taxation was organized to fund the army, but he forbade corruption and insisted that his officials serve with honesty. For a land fragmented by years of tribal rivalry, this was a remarkable achievement. The French recognized the strength of his movement. In May 1837, they signed the Treaty of Tafna with Abd al-Qadir. This treaty granted him control over a vast territory in western and central Algeria, effectively acknowledging him as ruler of much of the country. For the Emir, this was a strategic pause. He knew the French would eventually break the treaty, but he used the time to rebuild, reorganize, and prepare for the next storm. In those 2 years, Abd al-Qadir showed both his brilliance as a commander and his wisdom as a statesman. He fought with fire and steel, yet tempered war with diplomacy. He punished betrayal but rewarded loyalty. He built not just an army, but a nation in the heart of Algeria. By the late 1830s, he was no longer just a regional leader. He was the undisputed face of Algerian resistance, admired across the Muslim world and respected even in Europe. But he also knew that France, humiliated by repeated setbacks, was preparing for an even larger and more ruthless campaign. The peace of the Treaty of Tafna was fragile, a thin thread stretched over a storm. Abd al-Qadir could sense it in his bones. The greatest battles of his life were yet to come. Chapter 4: The Broken Treaty, 1838 to 1839. For a brief moment after the Treaty of Tafna in 1837, it seemed that Algeria had found balance. Abd al-Qadir al-Jaza'iri controlled vast territories across the interior, while the French held on to their coastal strongholds. To outsiders, it looked like a peace agreement. But to Abd al-Qadir, the treaty was only a pause, a chance to strengthen his people before the next inevitable clash. The Emir did not waste time. In the towns and villages under his rule, he focused on building institutions. His government at Tagdemp became more organized. Officials were appointed to oversee taxes, markets, and justice. He introduced a system of courts based on Islamic law, ensuring that even the poorest tribesman could bring his case before a judge. For a land long divided by tribal rivalries, Abd al-Qadir offered something new: unity under one banner. His vision went beyond administration. He wanted Algeria to be strong enough to stand as an independent state, not just a resistance movement. To do this, he invested in industry. Workshops produced gunpowder, bullets, and even cannons. Blacksmiths forged weapons while farmers were encouraged to plant more wheat and barley to feed the growing army. Roads were improved to move supplies quickly, and communication lines were established between key strongholds. At the same time, Abd al-Qadir continued to inspire loyalty through his personal character. He lived simply, avoided unnecessary luxury, and made himself accessible to his people. Soldiers saw him eating the same food they did and riding beside them in battle. This humility created trust. For the tribes who had once distrusted any central authority, Abd al-Qadir was different. He was not ruling for himself, but for Algeria. But peace with France was never meant to last. Many French officials were frustrated by the Treaty of Tafna. To them, it was humiliating to acknowledge the authority of a native leader over so much land. Paris wanted Algeria fully under French control, and it was only a matter of time before they found an excuse to break the agreement. That excuse came in late 1839. French troops, under General Vallée and the Duke of Orleans, marched through the Iron Gates, a mountain pass deep in Abd al-Qadir's territory. The move was a direct violation of the treaty, and Abd al-Qadir saw it for what it was, a deliberate provocation. The Emir immediately declared the treaty broken and called his people back to war. When the news spread, Algeria erupted. Tribes that had grown comfortable in peace once again rallied to Abd al-Qadir's banner. His army swelled, and his commanders prepared for the long campaign ahead. The Emir himself mounted his horse and rode from camp to camp, reminding his people of their duty. His words were sharp and filled with fire. France has broken its promise. Now we fight not only for our land but for our honor. The French expected resistance, but they were not prepared for the speed and fury of Abd al-Qadir's response. His men launched attacks across the countryside, burning French supply depots, ambushing patrols, and striking at weak points along the French lines. Once again, his mastery of guerrilla warfare left the enemy disoriented. French columns marched through valleys only to be cut off and harassed from the hills. Cavalry units swooped down on isolated garrisons, striking with precision before retreating into the vast Algerian interior. What shocked the French most was the discipline of Abd al-Qadir's army. Unlike many resistance movements that relied on raw courage alone, his soldiers were drilled and organized. They followed orders with precision, a reflection of their leader's ability to blend traditional tribal warriors with the discipline of a modern army. At the same time, Abd al-Qadir made sure that his war remained just. He forbade unnecessary violence and punished soldiers who harmed civilians. Prisoners of war were treated with dignity, often better than the French treated captured Algerians. These principles earned him respect, not only from his own people but even from some French officers, who admitted privately that the Emir fought with honor. The broken treaty marked a turning point. Abd al-Qadir was no longer fighting to secure recognition from France. He was fighting for the survival of his nation. The dream of a free and united Algeria was alive, but it would now face the full weight of French imperial ambition. As 1839 ended, the land was once again in flames. The fragile peace of the Tafna Treaty had shattered, and both sides prepared for a war fiercer than anything before. Abd al-Qadir, calm but resolute, knew what lay ahead. The years of fire and blood were just beginning. Chapter 5: War Without End, 1840 to 1841. By 1840, Algeria was once again at war. The Treaty of Tafna was broken, and Abd al-Qadir al-Jaza'iri stood at the head of a nation ready to resist. The French had underestimated him before, and now they faced an even stronger and more disciplined enemy. For Abd al-Qadir, this was not just another fight, it was a struggle for survival, for faith, and for the very soul of Algeria. The French response to his renewed resistance was swift. Determined to crush him once and for all, they poured more soldiers, supplies, and weapons into Algeria. Under the command of General Bugeaud, one of France's toughest officers, the French army began a brutal new strategy. Unlike earlier campaigns, which focused on capturing cities, Bugeaud waged total war. His orders were clear: cut off Abd al-Qadir from his people, destroy his bases, and leave no village that could support him. This marked the beginning of a devastating period for Algeria. French troops burned crops, slaughtered livestock, and forced entire tribes into submission. Villages suspected of aiding Abd al-Qadir were razed to the ground. The policy of scorched earth was meant to starve the resistance into defeat. For ordinary Algerians, life became a cycle of fear and survival. Yet, despite the destruction, Abd al-Qadir refused to surrender. His army adapted. No longer able to rely on fixed bases for long, they became even more mobile. Moving swiftly across the rugged landscape, they struck French garrisons, ambushed convoys, and melted away before reinforcements could arrive. Abd al-Qadir himself often led these raids, his white stallion charging through smoke and dust, his curved sword flashing as he directed his men. Witnesses described him as both calm and fierce, a commander whose presence inspired courage in the face of overwhelming odds. One of his greatest strengths was his ability to use the land itself as a weapon. He knew every valley, river, and mountain path. French columns often found themselves marching into traps, tight ravines where they were attacked from above, or open plains where Algerian cavalry could strike and vanish like shadows. These tactics frustrated the French, who struggled to pin him down. But the cost of this war was heavy. For every French convoy destroyed, Algerian villages paid the price of French retaliation. Abd al-Qadir felt the weight of this suffering. As a leader, he tried to shield his people, relocating families to safer areas and organizing supplies where he could. Still, he knew that resistance came with sacrifice, and he reminded his followers that their struggle was for the future of Algeria, for their children and grandchildren. Despite the hardships, Abd al-Qadir maintained his principles. He refused to allow unnecessary cruelty. French prisoners, often captured during raids, were treated with respect and given food and medical care. Stories spread even among French soldiers of the Emir's honor. Some called him a noble enemy, a warrior who fought with both steel and conscience. The French, however, were relentless. General Bugeaud introduced new tactics designed to crush the guerrilla movement. Instead of relying only on large columns, he divided his forces into smaller mobile units, able to move quickly across the terrain. He also built new forts to control key regions. Step by step, the French tightened their grip. By late 1841, Abd al-Qadir found himself under increasing pressure. His supply lines were cut, his bases destroyed, and many tribes were forced into submission. Yet even in this difficult time, he did not lose heart. He reorganized what remained of his forces, shifting deeper into the desert and adopting hit-and-run tactics. He told his men that the war was not about immediate victory but about endurance. "As long as we breathe," he said, "our land is not theirs." The War of 1840 to 1841 showed both the brilliance and the burden of Abd al-Qadir's leadership. He had proven that a united people could resist even the most powerful empire, but he also faced the reality of France's determination to conquer Algeria at any cost. For the Emir, the fight was no longer just about winning battles. It was about keeping the flame of resistance alive, no matter how dark the night became. As 1841 came to a close, Algeria was scarred by fire and blood. The French claimed they were breaking Abd al-Qadir's power, yet his name remained a rallying cry across the land. He was not only a commander but the living symbol of Algeria's defiance. And though the struggle grew harder, he carried on, knowing that the destiny of his people rested on his shoulders. Chapter 6: The Desert Stronghold, 1842 to 1843. By 1842, Abd al-Qadir al-Jaza'iri faced the greatest challenge of his life. French troops under General Bugeaud had unleashed fire and destruction across Algeria. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and entire tribes forced into submission. Yet, despite the devastation, Abd al-Qadir refused to give up. Instead, he looked south, to the vast Sahara Desert, for refuge and renewal. The desert was harsh, unforgiving, and to the French, nearly impassable. But to Abd al-Qadir, it was an ally. He knew the desert could hide his movements, shield his people, and serve as the base for rebuilding his resistance. Moving south, he established fortified camps in the wilderness, far from the reach of French columns. Here, among the endless sands, he reorganized his army and prepared for a new phase of war. Life in the desert was not easy. Food and water were scarce, and long marches tested the endurance of even the hardiest fighters. But Abd al-Qadir's presence inspired his men. He lived as they did, eating the same bread, sleeping on the ground, and sharing their hardships. His humility bound his soldiers to him in loyalty that no hardship could break. The French, frustrated by their inability to capture him, tried to extend their reach into the desert. But Abd al-Qadir used the terrain to his advantage. His cavalry, mounted on fast Arabian horses, could cover vast distances in short time. They struck French outposts, destroyed supply caravans, and disappeared back into the desert winds before the enemy could react. It was as if the Emir himself had become a shadow, haunting the French wherever they went. At the same time, Abd al-Qadir worked to strengthen alliances with desert tribes. He traveled to remote communities, meeting elders and sharing his vision of unity. Many were moved by his sincerity and his determination to defend Islam and Algeria. They offered him warriors, supplies, and safe passage across their lands. With each new ally, his influence spread deeper into the Sahara. In 1843, Abd al-Qadir's resistance reached a dramatic peak. From his desert base, he launched a daring series of raids that struck fear into French garrisons. His soldiers moved with lightning speed, cutting across dunes and rocky plateaus to strike where they were least expected. French generals admitted that they were facing not only a skilled commander but a man whose knowledge of the land was unmatched. But the French were learning. Determined to crush him, General Bugeaud adopted new tactics. He created mobile flying columns that could pursue Abd al-Qadir's cavalry more effectively. He also built a chain of forts and outposts stretching into the interior, slowly shrinking the Emir's space to maneuver. Each French move made the war harder for Abd al-Qadir, forcing him deeper into the desert and straining his resources. Still, even under this pressure, Abd al-Qadir remained committed to his principles. He reminded his men that they were not fighting only for victory in battle but for justice, dignity, and faith. He forbade looting, punished those who disobeyed, and ensured that captured French soldiers were treated with humanity. These actions set him apart from many leaders of his time and earned him admiration even among his enemies. By late 1843, the struggle had become a test of endurance. The French had the advantage of numbers, weapons, and supplies, But Abd al-Qadir had the desert, his faith, and the unbreakable will of his people. He told his followers, "The desert is our fortress. As long as we hold to God and to each other, we cannot be broken." Yet the pressure was mounting. French columns pushed further south, and tribes under strain from hunger and destruction began to waver. Abd al-Qadir could feel the tightening noose, but he refused despair. Instead, he prepared for the next stage of resistance, one that would push both him and his people to the very limits of survival. The desert stronghold gave Abd al-Qadir temporary shelter, but it also became the stage for some of the most desperate battles of his career. France was determined to finish the war, no matter the cost, and Abd al-Qadir knew that the fight ahead would be fiercer than anything he had faced before. As 1843 drew to a close, the Emir of Algeria stood in the heart of the desert, a symbol of endurance and defiance. His struggle was far from over, but the sands of the Sahara whispered his name, carrying the story of a leader who refused to bow before empire. Chapter 7: The Storm of 1844. By 1844, Abd al-Qadir al-Jaza'iri had been fighting the French for more than a decade. He had built alliances, forged an army, and turned the desert into his fortress. Yet the French were relentless. General Bugeaud's new tactics of mobile warfare and scorched earth were squeezing Abd al-Qadir's resistance from every side. Just as the Emir thought the struggle could not become more difficult, a new and unexpected storm arrived, from across the border with Morocco. Abd al-Qadir had long looked to Morocco as a potential ally. The Sultan of Morocco shared religious and cultural ties with Algeria, and many Algerians hoped their neighbor would support the resistance. For a time, the Sultan offered sanctuary. Abd al-Qadir's men could cross into Moroccan territory to rest, resupply, and regroup. The border became a lifeline for the Algerian resistance. But France was determined to close that lifeline. In 1844, French forces began pressuring Morocco, demanding that the Sultan withdraw his support for Abd al-Qadir. Tensions rose quickly, and soon the conflict escalated into open war. The French launched attacks along the border, and the Moroccan army clashed with French troops. The most decisive battle came at Isly in August 1844, where French forces inflicted a crushing defeat on Morocco's army. The result was disastrous for Abd al-Qadir. With Morocco forced into peace with France, the Emir lost his safe haven. French and Moroccan authorities agreed to deny him refuge, cutting off one of his most important sources of support. For the first time, Abd al-Qadir found himself surrounded with no friendly border to retreat to. But surrender was not in his nature. Instead of despair, Abd al-Qadir pushed his men harder. He reorganized his forces into smaller, faster units, capable of surviving even without external support. His soldiers carried only what they needed and relied on the land for supplies. They struck with precision, raiding French posts and then vanishing into the desert night. The French, even with their forts and columns, struggled to keep up. Yet the pressure on his people was immense. French raids devastated villages suspected of helping him. Families were displaced, crops destroyed, and hunger spread across the countryside. Many tribes, exhausted by years of suffering, began to waver. Some accepted French protection, while others remained loyal to Abd al-Qadir despite the hardships. The Emir understood their struggle but urged them to stay strong, reminding them that submission meant the loss of freedom for generations to come. In these dark times, Abd al-Qadir's personal qualities shone brightest. He continued to live simply, refusing luxury even when it was available. His soldiers saw their Emir share their hunger, sleep on the same ground, and ride into danger at their side. Stories spread of his calm leadership. How in the middle of battle, with bullets and cannon fire all around, he never lost composure. To his men, this was proof that God was with him. Still, Abd al-Qadir was a realist. He knew that Algeria could not match France's resources forever. His hope had been to keep the resistance alive until France tired of the war. But now, with Morocco neutralized, that hope grew weaker. He began to seek new ways to prolong the fight, looking southward into the Sahara once more, where French control was weakest. In late 1844, Abd al-Qadir led his forces deep into the desert, establishing hidden bases and moving constantly to avoid French pursuit. His enemies described him as the phantom of the desert, impossible to catch, always one step ahead. Even as French victories mounted, they could never capture the Emir. He remained a symbol of defiance, a reminder that Algeria's spirit was not broken. The storm of 1844 was a turning point. The defeat of Morocco meant that Abd al-Qadir was now alone, facing the full power of France without allies. Yet instead of breaking him, the storm hardened his resolve. He was no longer just a commander defending his land, he was the living embodiment of Algerian resistance. As the year ended, France celebrated its victories, but in the deserts of Algeria, Abd al-Qadir prepared for the next stage of the struggle. The war was not over. For every battle lost, he reminded his people, the fight for freedom endured. Chapter 8: The War of Shadows, 1845 to 1846. After the storm of 1844, Abd al-Qadir al-Jaza'iri found himself more isolated than ever. Morocco had been forced to make peace with France, and the Emir could no longer count on external allies. Yet even without support, Abd al-Qadir refused to surrender. Instead, he adapted. What followed was a new phase of struggle, one that would be remembered as the War of Shadows. The French believed they had cornered Abd al-Qadir. Their forts stretched across Algeria, and their mobile columns scoured the countryside. But the Emir turned this pressure into an advantage. He abandoned large armies, which were easy to track, and relied on small, fast-moving bands of fighters. These men could ride across mountains and deserts, strike quickly, and vanish into hidden valleys. To the French, it seemed like chasing ghosts. The Emir's new strategy relied on surprise. His soldiers attacked French patrols at night, ambushed supply lines, and melted away before reinforcements could arrive. He trained them to use the land as a weapon, hiding in ravines, using the sun to blind their enemies, and striking during sandstorms when the French were vulnerable. Every attack carried the mark of Abd al-Qadir's discipline and cunning. But while his tactics kept the resistance alive, the human cost was severe. French generals escalated their brutal policies, burning villages and seizing livestock to break the people's will. Civilians who were suspected of helping Abd al-Qadir were punished without mercy. The Emir faced the agonizing reality of watching his people suffer for their loyalty to him. Yet he refused to abandon them. He sent envoys to encourage tribes, shared what supplies he could, and reminded them that their struggle was not only for Algeria but for faith and dignity. One of the most dramatic moments of this shadow war came in 1845, when Abd al-Qadir led his fighters into a daring escape near the Sahara. Surrounded by multiple French columns, he seemed trapped. French officers believed they had finally cornered the Emir. But using his intimate knowledge of the terrain, Abd al-Qadir led his men through a narrow gorge under cover of darkness. By morning, the French discovered only empty ground. Once again, the Emir had slipped through their grasp. Stories of his escapes spread quickly, turning him into a legend even among the French. Some officers grudgingly admitted respect for him, calling him a commander of rare genius. His ability to survive, to outwit larger forces, and to inspire loyalty under the harshest conditions earned him admiration across the Mediterranean. Yet despite these victories of spirit, Abd al-Qadir knew the situation was becoming desperate. The French army continued to grow, and with every passing year, their grip on Algeria tightened. Villages that once supported him began to falter, exhausted by hunger and raids. Some tribes surrendered, seeking protection from the French, while others remained faithful but weakened. In 1846, Abd al-Qadir attempted one last great effort to rally the resistance. He called on all remaining loyal tribes to gather, urging them to remember that surrender would mean the loss of their freedom and identity. His words carried power, but reality weighed heavily. The Emir was fighting not only against the French, but against time itself. Still, he pressed forward. In a series of lightning raids, his fighters struck French supply depots and scattered enemy patrols. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the spirit of resistance had been reborn. But each victory came at a cost, draining his already limited resources. The French responded with crushing force, sending columns deeper into the desert, determined to eliminate his bases once and for all. By the end of 1846, Abd al-Qadir's situation was fragile. His men were exhausted, food supplies were thin, and the French presence was overwhelming. Yet even in these darkest moments, the Emir held to his faith. He prayed with his men before every battle, reminding them that victory was not measured only in land or weapons, but in the strength to resist injustice. The War of Shadows kept Abd al-Qadir alive, but it was not enough to turn the tide. His resistance had become a legend, but legends alone could not feed his soldiers or shelter his people. The French were closing in, and Abd al-Qadir faced the hardest decision of his life. Whether to continue fighting to the death, or to preserve his people through another path. As 1846 ended, Algeria still looked to him as the symbol of freedom. The Emir of the desert, the commander who moved like a shadow, stood unbroken. But the struggle was entering its final, painful stage. Chapter 9, The Breaking Point, 1847. By 1847, Abd al-Qadir al-Jaza'iri had been at war for more than 15 years. He had survived battles, betrayals, and sieges. He had turned the desert into his shield and kept the spirit of resistance alive when defeat seemed certain. But even legends reached their limits. The year 1847 marked the breaking point for both Abd al-Qadir and his people. The French campaign against him had become relentless. General Bugeaud and his successors applied the scorched earth policy with brutal efficiency. Entire villages were torched, wells poisoned, and crops destroyed. Families were uprooted and herded into controlled zones to prevent them from helping the Emir. What had once been a proud and independent countryside now lay scarred by smoke and famine. Abd al-Qadir's forces were dwindling. His fighters were still loyal, but their numbers had fallen, their horses were tired, and their weapons were few. Food was scarce, and morale was wearing thin. The Emir did what he always did: he shared the same hardships as his men. He ate the same meager rations, rode beside them on long marches, and never asked of them what he would not do himself. Yet even this example could not erase the reality that the resistance was running out of strength. The tribes, too, were reaching exhaustion. For years they had endured punishment for their loyalty, burned homes, lost families, and endless raids. Many had already surrendered to the French, seeking relief from suffering. Those who remained with Abd al-Qadir were torn between devotion to him and the need to protect their people from starvation. The Emir understood their struggle. He felt the weight of their sacrifice every day. Still, Abd al-Qadir did not surrender easily. In early 1847, he attempted to rebuild his power with one last campaign. He moved south into the Sahara again, hoping to regroup, recruit fresh fighters, and reignite the spirit of resistance. His cavalry launched daring raids, hitting French columns and supply routes. Once more, he proved his genius for survival, slipping past French patrols and vanishing into the desert like a mirage. But this time, the French were prepared. They tightened their network of forts, coordinated their columns more effectively, and cut off routes that once gave Abd al-Qadir freedom of movement. Worse still, Morocco, which had once offered him sanctuary, now stood firmly against him. The border was closed. The desert, which had once been his fortress, began to feel like a prison. By summer, the Emir's situation was desperate. His army was reduced to a fraction of its former strength. Ammunition was low, supplies nearly gone, and hunger stalked his camps. His men were still devoted, but they could no longer hide their exhaustion. Abd al-Qadir knew the truth: to continue fighting meant condemning his people to destruction. It was then that he made the most painful decision of his life. Rather than let his people perish, Abd al-Qadir chose to surrender. But he would do so on his terms, as a man of honor. He did not give himself up to just anyone, he demanded guarantees. In December 1847, he approached French authorities under the promise that he and his family would be allowed safe passage into exile in the Middle East. He laid down his arms, not in defeat of spirit, but in the hope of saving his people from further suffering. The news shook Algeria. Some wept, believing the struggle was over. Others admired his courage in making such a difficult choice. Even among the French, many respected the Emir's dignity and honor. He had fought them longer and harder than anyone thought possible, and he had never abandoned his principles. But the French government broke its promise. Instead of granting him safe passage, they imprisoned al-Qadir in France. For years he was kept in confinement, far from his homeland. Yet even in captivity, he remained a figure of respect. Visitors described him as calm, dignified, and deeply spiritual. His presence carried the same strength that had led men into battle across Algeria. The breaking point of 1847 was not the end of Abd al-Qadir's story, but it was the end of his war. The resistance that he had led with brilliance and sacrifice came to a close. Algeria fell deeper under French control, but the memory of Abd al-Qadir's struggle endured. His surrender was not a defeat of spirit, it was a testament to his humanity, his refusal to sacrifice his people when no victory was possible. As the year closed, Abd al-Qadir was no longer free, but his name remained alive in the hearts of Algerians. The Emir had become more than a commander, he was a symbol of dignity, honor, and the unyielding desire for freedom. Chapter 10: The Legacy of a Lion, 1848–1883. After his surrender in 1847, Abd al-Qadir al-Jaza'iri was taken to France under promises of safe passage to the Middle East. Those promises were broken. Instead, he and his family were imprisoned in the fortress of Toulon, then later moved to Pau and finally to Amboise. For years, the Emir who had once commanded armies and outwitted generals was confined behind stone walls. Yet captivity did not break him. Even in prison, Abd al-Qadir remained calm, dignified, and devoted to faith. He spent his days in prayer, study, and reflection. His composure impressed even his jailers, who came to respect him not as a defeated enemy but as a man of deep wisdom. Visitors described him as serene, with a commanding presence that no prison could diminish. He endured hardship without complaint, believing that patience was also a form of struggle. In 1852, the French Emperor Napoleon III ordered his release. True to his earlier wish, Abd al-Qadir and his family were allowed to settle in the Ottoman Empire. He first lived in Bursa, then later in Damascus, Syria. Here, far from the battlefields of Algeria, the Emir began a new chapter of his life, not as a warrior, but as a scholar, mediator, and spiritual leader. Abd al-Qadir's reputation followed him. In Damascus, he became respected as a man of peace and wisdom. He devoted himself to religious study, writing works on Islamic philosophy, ethics, and Sufism. His scholarship earned him admiration from scholars and leaders across the Muslim world. Yet his influence was not limited to Muslims alone. In 1860, when sectarian violence erupted in Damascus between Druze and Christians, Abd al-Qadir took extraordinary action. Risking his own safety, he sheltered thousands of Christians in his home and organized his followers to protect them. His courage saved countless lives. When news of this reached Europe, Abd al-Qadir was celebrated not only as a Muslim hero but as a universal symbol of humanity. The French, who had once fought him, honored him with medals. Leaders across Europe praised his actions, calling him a man of conscience and compassion. Despite his fame abroad, Abd al-Qadir never forgot Algeria. Though he could not return, he carried the memory of his homeland with him. He often spoke of the suffering of his people under French rule and prayed for their freedom. Yet he also believed in the importance of reconciliation and coexistence. His later life reflected a vision of peace rooted in faith, tolerance, and respect for human dignity. In his final years, Abd al-Qadir became a figure of legend. To Algerians, he was the lion who had resisted the French Empire for years, the Emir who had lived among his soldiers, shared their hunger, and never abandoned his principles. To the wider world, he was a statesman, philosopher, and humanitarian. Few men in history had bridged such roles with such integrity. On May 26, 1883, Abd al-Qadir passed away in Damascus at the age of 75. His death was mourned across the Muslim world and beyond. Leaders, scholars, and ordinary people remembered him not only as a warrior but as a man of honor, faith, and compassion. He was buried in Damascus, though decades later his remains were returned to Algeria, where he rests today in Algiers, honored as a national hero. The legacy of Abd al-Qadir al-Jaza'iri is more than the story of battles and wars. It is the story of a man who fought for freedom with courage, who surrendered with dignity to save his people, and who lived his later years as a peacemaker. His life showed that true leadership is not only measured in victories but in principles, justice, humility, and humanity. For Algeria, Abd al-Qadir remains a founding figure of national identity. For the world, he remains proof that even in an age of empire and conquest, one man's faith and honor could inspire generations. His story continues to echo today, a reminder that resistance can take many forms and that the greatest leaders are those who serve both God and humanity.